I picked up my husband's suit from the dry cleaner. The clerk reached into the inside pocket, found a folded note, turned pale and whispered, "Ma'am, don't go home until you read this." It was written in my daughter's handwriting, and by the time I finished reading it, I realized my own family wasn't just fighting over money anymore. They were quietly arranging my decline. If you've ever had the sick feeling that concern in your family might really be control, stay with me. And if stories like this hit something deep in you, subscribe now. Because some betrayals do not arrive as explosions. Some arrive as paperwork, soft voices, doctor appointments, pills you didn't ask for, and people calling your fear confusion. My name is Kathleen Mercer. I'm 68 years old. I live outside Atlanta with my husband, Thomas. We've been married 44 years. He was a contractor before retiring. I spent 29 years as a school counselor. We raised 2 children. Our son Brian is 38. Our daughter Laura is 35. Brian is married to Nicole. Laura is divorced and lives 40 minutes away with her teenage son, Evan. And if you had asked me a month ago what was wrong in my family, I would have given you the kind of answer women like me have been trained to give our whole lives. Oh, the usual. Too much stress. Too many strong personalities. Some inheritance tension after my mother passed. I would not have said, "They are building a case that I can't manage my own life." I would not have said, "Someone has been tampering with my medication." I would not have said, "My daughter-in-law speaks about my future as if I am a legal obstacle in heels." And I definitely would not have said, "My own daughter may have been trying clumsily and too late to warn me." My mother died 11 months ago. She was 91. Sharp to the end. I know people say that all the time, but in her case it was true. She remembered birthdays, tax deadlines, old addresses, everyone's favorite pie, and once corrected a probate attorney on the wording of a clause in her own trust from a hospital bed 3 weeks before she died. She left behind a modestly complicated estate. Not billionaire money. Not some Southern dynasty. Fantasy. But enough. Enough to make people recalculate their moral values when they thought no one was watching. There was a lake house in Alabama. A portion of family land. A few well-performing investment accounts. A trust structure. And one clause that changed everything. Thomas and I would remain the managing parties of the trust while we were alive and competent. Only after both of us passed would larger distributions move to Brian, Laura, and several cousins on my mother's side. That clause was read aloud in a lawyer's office on a rainy Thursday morning. I remember almost every face in the room. Brian looked down. Laura went still. Nicole smiled too quickly. My cousin Denise leaned forward before the sentence was even fully finished and asked about possible liquidity options if the property became inefficient to hold. That was when I should have understood something. People reveal themselves in the first question they ask after death. At the time I only thought, grief makes people strange. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was believing grief was the strongest thing in the room. It wasn't. Opportunity was. The months after my mother died were full of conversations that, at the time, felt irritating but survivable. Nicole saying in her smooth professional tone that elder-led asset management can become a bottleneck. Brian suggesting Thomas and I streamline decision authority before something unexpected forces rushed choices. Laura crying one evening in my kitchen about rent, tuition for Evan, and how unfair it was that Brian had stable equity while she was always one bad month from falling behind. Denise texting me links about vacation rental potential at the lake house and saying things like, "No point in preserving dead people's sentiment if the living need cash." That sentence stayed with me. No point in preserving dead people's sentiment. It was about the lake house. But now I think it was about more than that. People like Denise do not just liquidate property. They liquidate reverence. Nicole was worse. Denise was greedy out loud. Nicole was greedy in polished language. She worked in estate administration. That matters. Because Nicole knew exactly how to make control sound like concern. She never said, "You should step aside because you're old." She said things like, "It may be wise to plan transitions early. Sometimes children can reduce burden for aging parents." Cognitive fatigue often appears before people recognize it themselves. Temporary authority structures can protect everyone. Protect. Temporary. Transition. Burden. Those words started appearing around me with strange frequency. And I heard them. But I did not hear them. That is what happens when decent people are targeted by people who understand legal language better than moral language. You assume they are over-organized. You do not assume they are rehearsing a theft. The first time Nicole made me feel truly cold was at Thanksgiving. We were all in my dining room. Turkey. Sweet potatoes. Silver polished the way my mother taught me. And Nicole said, laughing lightly over cranberry sauce, "Honestly, if anything ever happened to you and Thomas, no one would know where anything is. That's terrifying. You really should let Brian help centralize things before a crisis." It landed like a joke. That is how these things begin. Not with a threat. With a joke. I smiled and said, "Nothing is lost. I know exactly where everything is." Nicole smiled back. "But what if one day you don't?" Everyone went quiet for a second. Then Laura changed the subject. Brian stared at his plate. Thomas squeezed my knee under the table. And no one said what should have been said. Which was, that is an ugly thing to joke about. But ugliness grows when politeness waters it. Christmas was worse. Nicole wanted trust copies for transparency. Brian wanted a conversation about future contingencies. Laura wanted to talk privately about whether Mom really seemed more forgetful lately. Forgetful. That word showed up 3 times in 1 month. Then 5. Then 10. I started hearing it attached to things that had never happened. "Mom, you already told me that. You forgot Denise was coming, right? You seemed confused on the phone yesterday. You've been mixing up dates." Had I? Sometimes I genuinely couldn't tell. That is the frightening genius of certain manipulations. They do not begin by proving you are confused. They begin by repeating confusion back to you until you start checking your own mind before you check their motives. One afternoon in March, Nicole handed me a small amber bottle and said, "These helped my aunt sleep during menopause and later with stress. They're all natural." All natural. I laughed and said, "Nicole, I lived through the 80s. I know that phrase means absolutely nothing." She laughed too. But she left the bottle on my kitchen counter. A week later, Laura asked if I had started taking them because you do seem less sharp when you're tired. 2 weeks after that, I was sleeping badly, then waking groggy, then having strange dizzy spells mid-morning, then moments of mental fog that felt just real enough to scare me and just subtle enough to dismiss. I blamed age, stress, grief, the weather, everything except the truth. The truth was that someone had been building a story around me, a story in which I was still upright, still dressed properly, still speaking clearly, but not entirely reliable, not entirely capable, not entirely safe alone with decisions. And once that story exists inside a family, paperwork follows. That is what no one tells you about family betrayal. It rarely begins with money moving. It begins with narrative. First they change the story of who you are. Then they change who gets to sign. My husband Thomas had a routine heart procedure scheduled for the following Tuesday. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing especially high risk. But enough to create paperwork windows. Enough to create emotional chaos. Enough to allow people to say things like, "Let's just get this signed before the procedure. It'll make everything easier if anything unexpected happens. We should update authority now while everyone is here." Those sentences had been floating around us for weeks. I did not understand how coordinated they were until the note appeared. The day I picked up Thomas's suit was a Wednesday. I remember because I had gone to the dry cleaner after buying lemons and flowers for the kitchen. It was an ordinary errand day. That matters. Because the scariest moments of your life almost always begin inside ordinary days. The dry cleaner was the same one we had used for years. Small family place. Quiet. Smelled like starch and steam and those little wrapped mints people leave in bowls near registers. Marisol was working that day. I knew her by sight and voice, but not much beyond that. She brought Thomas's charcoal suit out in plastic and smiled the way people do when they've seen your life in small repeated pieces. Then she slipped her hand into the inside pocket and said, "Almost sent this through pressing." She pulled out a folded note. At first she smiled. Then she unfolded it. Then her face changed. She looked at me, then at the door, then back at me, and in a voice so soft I nearly missed it, she said, "Ma'am, don't go home until you read this." I took the paper. One side had a grocery list. Milk, celery, coffee filters, frozen berries. The other side was in Laura's handwriting. I knew it instantly. There is a particular cruelty in recognizing the handwriting of someone you taught to hold a pencil. It said, "Brian says if Dad signs the amendment before the surgery, Mom won't be able to stop anything. Nicole thinks the medication is making her foggy enough already. Denise says once the lake house sells, everything else will move faster." Then lower down, "Just keep Mom distracted until after Tuesday. If she starts asking questions, tell her Dr. Feldman was the one who suggested temporary guardianship." I read it once, then again, and there are moments when the body understands before the mind allows itself to. My fingers went numb. My jaw locked. The floor felt like it tilted half an inch. Temporary guardianship. Medication making me foggy enough already. Trust amendment before surgery. Every strange conversation from the past few months snapped into alignment like magnets finding each other. Marisol asked quietly, "Do you need me to call someone?" I said no. "But tell me exactly where this was." "In the inside pocket," she said. "Folded deep." Thomas never carried folded notes in his suit pockets. Never. Which meant Laura had slipped it there on Sunday when they all came by after church. And if she had, then one of two things was true. Either she meant for me to find it, or she was panicked enough to hide it where she thought she could retrieve it later. Neither possibility comforted me. I sat in my car with the air off and the windows up for nearly 20 minutes. Not crying. Not calling anyone. Just reading the note until my eyes stopped focusing on the words and started seeing the whole shape. This was not loose greed. This was choreography. Finally I called Thomas. And what I said next was the hardest sentence I had ever spoken to my husband. "Do not sign anything. Do not take any medication anyone hands you unless I watch them open it. And whatever you do, do not tell the kids I know." He went still. Then asked, "What happened?" I said, "I think they're trying to move us out of our own lives while pretending it's help." There was a long silence. Then he said, "Come home." "I will. But not before I stop somewhere else." That stop was our lawyer's office. Her name was Janet Crowley. She handled my mother's trust. She was not warm. I did not need warm. I needed exact. She read the note, then read it again, then said, "If this is genuine, they may be preparing to use your husband's procedure as leverage for an amendment, a temporary authority shift, and a competence narrative around you." Competence narrative. What a civilized phrase for attempted theft. Janet asked, "Have there been medication changes? New forms? Odd financial activity? Increased references to your memory or confusion?" Yes. Too many yes. Nicole's natural supplements. Laura's repeated concern about me being forgetful. Brian's push to sign cleanup papers before the surgery. Denise's obsession with liquidation. Janet's face hardened. "Go to the bank. Then your doctor. Then home. Bring me every trust paper and every recent medical or financial document by tomorrow morning. And do not be alone with any of them if you can avoid it." That is the moment my life shifted from suspicion to procedure. I called my younger brother Mark. Because when a family starts rewriting your reality, you do not call the child most likely to be in denial. You call the sibling who knew you before anyone needed anything from you. Mark drove over. Within 40 minutes. Thomas was waiting at the kitchen table when I got home. He read the note with both hands flat against the wood as if bracing for impact. "They wouldn't," he said first. Then softer. "Nicole would." That was the first honest sentence either of us had said all day. We spent the next 3 hours opening everything. Bank accounts, email, prescription bottles, trust folders, legal drafts. And the deeper we looked, the uglier it became. The first discovery was small enough to feel almost insulting. Regular transfers. Not huge. Just enough to disappear if you were not paying close attention. Recurring reimbursements and administrative fees, linked to one of the trust-related accounts Brian had been allowed to interface with after my mother's death. Then we found a draft legal file in Thomas's email from an office we had never authorized. A partial trust amendment. Prepared but unsigned. Language narrowing decision rights. Expanding emergency discretion. Referencing potential medical incapacity triggers. Not fully enforceable, but ready. Ready is what chilled me. Then I opened my current prescription bottle and compared the pills to the older refill I still had in the cabinet because I'm the kind of woman who keeps old bottles until recycling day. They did not match. Same label. Different pills. My whole body went cold. I called my prescribing physician's office. Not Dr. Feldman, the name in the note. My real doctor. They fit me in that afternoon after Mark insisted it was urgent. When she looked at the pills, her face changed instantly. These are not the medication I prescribed, she said. Could they make me disoriented? I asked. Yes, she said without hesitation. They could absolutely make you foggy, sleepy, unfocused. Especially if taken consistently. There are moments when fear becomes very clean. That was one of them. Because now I knew. They were not simply preparing to call me confused. They were helping me look confused. That distinction matters. One is insult. The other is assault. By evening, the plan was in motion. Janet froze discretionary trust actions. The bank restricted all third-party discussions. My doctor documented medication tampering and confirmed I showed no signs of cognitive impairment. Mark brought over 3 cameras and installed them in the kitchen, hallway, and study. And I sent one text to the family group chat. Dinner Sunday at our place. I'd like everyone together before Thomas's procedure. Brian replied first. Of course. Nicole added a heart. Laura wrote, okay. Denise wrote, only if there's real food. People tell on themselves even in punctuation. Sunday became a stage the moment I sent that text. I knew it. Janet knew it. Mark knew it. Even Thomas knew it, though he said very little. When your husband of 44 years goes quiet in a crisis, you learn to listen to the shape of the silence. He wasn't afraid in the ordinary way. He was grieving before the funeral, grieving the idea of our children. Sunday arrived. I set the table myself. Blue plates, white flowers, roast chicken, good silver, candles. Not because I wanted beauty, because I wanted order. There are nights when you set a table not for dinner, but for truth. Laura arrived first. That told me more than almost anything else. She looked exhausted. Beautiful still, but thin around the eyes, like someone who had not slept properly in weeks. When I hugged her, she trembled. That was when I knew. She had known enough to panic. Not enough to stop it, but enough to be rotting inside it. Brian and Nicole arrived together. Nicole carried wine. Brian carried that strained, overbright smile adult sons use when they sense family tension but still think charm can flatten it. Denise arrived last, trailing perfume and appetite, already talking about traffic. Mark was already in the study, by invitation. Not hidden exactly, just not yet visible. We sat. We ate. We talked about ordinary things. School schedules. Construction on the highway. Thomas's procedure. Atlanta weather. It was unbearable. That fake family normalcy that only exists when everybody knows something is wrong, and no one wants to be the first to put blood on the white tablecloth. Then I placed the note in the center of the table between the potatoes and the breadbasket. No one breathed. Laura went white. Brian stared. Nicole's face remained composed for 1 second too long. That 1 second told me everything. Denise muttered, well, that well told me even more. I said, who wants to start? Laura burst into tears first. That is how I knew she wasn't the architect. Only the weak link. Brian said there had been misunderstandings about planning. Nicole said we were making paranoia out of one scribbled fragment. Then I told them about the pills. And after that, nobody could credibly pretend we were still discussing inheritance. The room changed temperature. Brian looked at Nicole. Really looked at her. And for one long second I watched a man understand that the woman beside him had been building a machine, and he had mistaken his own participation for harmless pragmatism. Nicole recovered quickly. She said the medication issue must have been a pharmacy error. A mix-up. A reorder problem. Then Mark walked in from the study with the bank logs and the legal draft folder Janet had assembled. I had asked him to wait for that exact moment. Because if people are going to quietly rearrange your life, sometimes the only way to stop them is to make the truth impossible to contain. What followed was not a screaming match. It was worse. It was an audit. Dates. transfers, draft amendments, medication records, doctor contacts, emails, references to Dr. Feldman, messages about timing around Thomas's procedure. Nicole's face finally changed when Janet arrived with a process server and 2 detectives. Because yes, I had invited them too. You do not set a table like that twice in one lifetime. One detective asked Laura to step into the den. Another asked Brian for his phone. Nicole asked for a lawyer. Denise tried to leave. Mark blocked the foyer. That night, for the first time in months, I understood the full anatomy of family betrayal. There is always one mastermind, one coward, one opportunist, one person who stays silent because silence pays, and one moment when the whole arrangement collapses because somebody the family assumed was aging quietly finally decides to look directly at what is happening. In our case, Nicole was the architect. Brian was the enabler. Laura was the frightened witness. Denise was the circling opportunist. And I was the woman they mistook for manageable. The next several weeks moved like litigation and grief due, simultaneously too fast and too slow. Nicole's devices were searched. Brian's email was subpoenaed. Laura cooperated almost immediately once given formal protection. And what surfaced was uglier than I had even imagined at that table. Nicole had drafted a multi-step plan around Thomas's procedure. It began with a temporary authority shift justified by medical stress. Then an amendment narrowing my practical control. Then documentation around my cognitive strain. Then, eventually, a permanent guardianship petition if I resisted. They had used language like, reduce volatility, protect value, centralize control, prepare transition if she decompensates. No one had written, take their life. That is what makes white-collar family predation so chilling. It often never names the violence plainly. It just builds a system in which you are no longer legally yourself. Brian had gone along with more than he admitted. At first, he tried to position himself as confused, just overwhelmed, just trusting Nicole. But then the emails appeared. He had asked questions about signatures, asked whether Thomas would be clear-headed enough before anesthesia consultations, asked whether my recent episodes were sufficient groundwork. Episodes. One dizzy spell caused by tampered medication became an episode in his language. That is how people betray you in stages. First they observe, then they describe, then they weaponize the description. Laura's role was Messier. She had known enough to be frightened, not enough to walk away. She had written the note after overhearing an argument between Nicole and Brian in my laundry room the Sunday before. She had hidden it in Thomas's suit because she panicked and because she believed, probably correctly, that if she texted or called, Nicole would find out. Was it heroic? No. Was it enough? Barely. But barely still counts when the alternative is silence. Denise, true to form, had never cared about process except where it accelerated her payout. She had pushed hardest for selling the lake house. She had repeated Nicole's talking points to relatives. And in one spectacularly stupid voice memo recovered from her phone she said, if they can't manage, they can't manage. You can't let old people sit on money forever. Old people sit on money. That line became famous in the extended family. Everyone repeated it in horror. Because once spoken aloud, greed sounds so much smaller than it felt in the speaker's body. Charges came next. Fraud conspiracy, document manipulation, financial exploitation attempts, prescription interference. Nicole carried the heaviest legal exposure. Denise less but enough. Brian was not criminally destroyed in the same way, but he was legally and morally ruined enough to understand that his life would not survive intact. Thomas had the procedure with private oversight and came through well. That mattered more than all the rest. There is only so much justice the body can appreciate if the heart is still under threat. We amended the trust ourselves afterward. Not to punish, to clarify. That distinction matters to me. Punishment feels hot. Clarification is cold. It protects the future. Laura's share was preserved but structured differently. Brian's was significantly reduced and conditioned. Denise's prospective access through future discretionary channels vanished entirely. Mark, who had wanted none of this and asked for nothing, was given oversight authority because he had been the only relative in the room who behaved like kin rather than a claimant. People asked me later whether I regretted not seeing the signs sooner. Yes and no. Yes, because earlier clarity might have saved us months of private poison. No, because I understand something now that I did not understand then. When you are raised to maintain family harmony, you are not taught to detect soft legal violence. You are taught to call it concern, to call it stress, to call it bad timing, to call it misunderstanding. That is how decent women become easy marks for indecent systems. 18 months have passed. Thomas is well. Stronger, actually. He cooks more than he used to. He waters the herbs on the balcony like they owe him rent. Mark still calls every Thursday. Not because he needs anything. Because he knows that after certain kinds of betrayal, consistency is one form of love. Laura's in therapy. She comes by once every few weeks. Sometimes with Evan. Sometimes alone. She does not ask me to hurry forgiveness. That is the only reason forgiveness is still possible. One afternoon she sat in my kitchen and said, "I think I let my fear of being the poor one in the family make me morally weak." That sentence broke my heart more than her tears ever did. Because it was true. Family resentment often sounds like ideology when it is really just humiliation fermenting without character. Brian and Nicole divorced. Of course they did. Machines like that rarely survive exposure. Without secrecy, the chemistry changes. Brian called me 6 months after everything collapsed and said, "I think I kept telling myself Nicole was the one making the ugly parts practical, so I didn't have to hear how ugly the idea was." I told him, "That is called cowardice." He said yes. Quietly. It was the first honest word he had offered me in almost a year. Denise moved to Florida. Naturally. According to one cousin, she still says she was misunderstood. People who profit from confusion always call clarity cruel. As for me, I still keep the note, folded inside an envelope in my desk. Not because I like remembering, because it reminds me of something important. The first time someone starts describing you as forgetful when you are not forgetful, listen carefully. The first time help arrives with legal vocabulary and urgency, listen carefully. The first time a younger family member talks about your future, as if it is an administrative inconvenience, listen carefully. It may not be care. It may be rehearsal. Thomas and I sold the lake house. That part surprised people. They thought after all the fighting I would cling to it. I didn't. I had spent too long confusing preservation with loyalty. The house had become a magnet for the worst instincts in the family. So we sold it. Took the proceeds into the trust. Donated a portion in my mother's name to a scholarship fund for first-generation students in Alabama. That gave me more peace than keeping the porch ever could have. Objects are not sacred just because blood fought over them. Sometimes the holiest thing you can do is remove the altar. We also moved. Not far. Just enough. A new condo with fewer stairs, better light, and no memories baked into the drywall. People assumed we moved because we were afraid. That isn't exactly true. We moved because after a family tries to reorganize your life without your consent, it feels good to choose the next room yourself. I started gardening again. Container roses this time. Smaller than the old yard, but that suited me. I joined a women's finance literacy group at church and ended up teaching 2 sessions on recognizing coercive family language around estates, health decisions, and guardianship. That made me laugh the first time I said it aloud. I had spent my life counseling teenagers. Then in late life, I found myself teaching retired women how to identify when their adult children had mistaken love for legal access. Sometimes God gives you the job only after he lets you survive the lesson. Evan, Laura's son, asked me one afternoon, "Grandma, how do you know when grown-ups are trying to help and when they're trying to control?" That may be the best question anyone asked me in all of this. I told him, "Real help leaves you more yourself afterward. Control leaves you less." He thought about that for a while, then nodded like he understood. I hope he keeps that sentence. I wish someone had given it to me sooner. Sometimes I still wake in the night thinking about the dry cleaner, Marisol's face, the folded paper, the ordinary fluorescent light above the counter, and I think about how close danger can come to looking like an errand. That is what unsettles me most. Not that family can betray you. History is full of that. It's how tidy the setup was. How bureaucratic. How pastel. How polished. No poison in a dramatic glass. No shouting over a will. Just supplements. Concerns. Amendments. Temporary authority. If I had not found that note, I think the next 6 months of my life would have been a blur of signatures, whispered concern, medical framing, and gradual exclusion from decisions bearing my own name. That is a terrifying thing to understand. Not because it happened, because it could have happened so cleanly. That is why I tell this story. Not for spectacle. For recognition. Because somewhere, some woman is being told right now that she seems a little more tired lately. A little more forgetful. A little more overwhelmed. Some son is saying, let me just handle it for now. Some daughter-in-law is talking about efficiency. Some cousin is talking about what makes financial sense. And some husband is trusting that the people smiling at his hospital bed still believe he belongs to himself. If that is you, listen to me carefully. Love does not rush your signatures. Love does not rewrite your symptoms. Love does not swap your medication and call it support. Love does not build a legal case around your fatigue. Love can be practical. Yes, love can be organized. Absolutely. But love does not require your erasure to function. That is the line. And once you feel it, do not explain it away just because the people crossing it share your blood. If there is one thing I learned, it is this. Families do not fall apart when the police arrive. They fall apart the day love becomes strategy. The police just show up later to document the ruins. I have not become bitter. That would be the easy story to tell. I have become exact. There is a difference. Bitterness poisons everything. Exactness lets you live. I know now who belongs at my table, who gets a key, who gets trust, who gets access to medical updates, who asks questions because they love me, and who asks them because they are measuring the room. That knowledge is expensive, but once you have paid for it, you never need to buy it twice. So tell me honestly, if you found proof that your own family was quietly arranging your health, your money, and your future around your decline, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them immediately? Would you have stayed silent and gathered evidence? Would you have cut everyone off that same day? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever had to learn the difference between love and access the hard way, subscribe. Because some stories are not just stories. Some are warnings. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.